And here's the thing, how do we fix the UK health crisis? And it's right that we use the word crisis, by the way. You know that phrase, they kicked the can into the long grass? It's never going to happen in our lifetimes, so let's not worry about it now. We'll deal with it some other time. That kind of thinking. And they did this with public sector pensions, of course, in the late 1940s, when they decided that anyone who works in the public sector can retire at about 50 on an index-linked pension, probably a one-off payment of 50k to see you nicely on your way. Essentially, you only got to work half your life. Nice work if you can get it. But by the late 1950s, they knew this was clearly not achievable given the unrecognisable increase in the amount of public sector workers and the billions of pounds of money that would be needed. So they kicked the can into the long grass. Someone else can deal with it. The 60s, the 70s, the 80s came and went, and still that can was rusting away in some distant, overgrown lawn. And then by around about the 2000s, they suddenly realised they needed to deal with it, and all hell broke loose. You know the rest. And while public sector workers were having it off royally with gold-plated pensions, another row was brewing behind the scenes. NHS, and in particular social care. So think about this. The population of the UK in 1940 was around about 48 million. Today, it's not far off 68 million. The average UK lifespan back in 1940 was about 66. Today, it's 81. Now, you don't need to be a student of medical statistics to spot the problem. 20 million more people, all living 15 years longer. The NHS and social care was always going to take a hit, but it was kicked into the long grass. That can stay there for decades, of course. Today, it's been retrieved, and now politicians are looking at this as if they've just stumbled on a large lump of kryptonite. This is where we're at. Boris Johnson said he would deal with it. He sort of tried, but it was never going to be enough. And today we get this warning. The NHS and social care are in the most perilous position in memory. A group of leading charities have warned this. This is the Richmond Group of Charities. We'll be chatting shortly to their chief executive. They said systems were reaching crunch point, which would mean the NHS and social care services are completely unable to respond to local needs in a growing number of places. Let's just think about this, and let's just fess up and recognise this. We have a crisis, a genuine crisis. This country should be dealing with this as a national emergency. We should be on a war footing over this right now. A country that can't look after its elderly is not fit for purpose. And that's where we're at on this. I'm happy to take your comments on the wider issue of the NHS. As Kevin O'Sullivan said, we talk about this all the time, and we always talk about, oh, it's going to be the worst winter on record, etc. We're talking here about the entire calendar year. This isn't just about the fact that obviously you get the chills at winter time and the flus and the COVIDs return, etc. as a bit more pressure, and the NHS seem to deal with it. What we're not recognising is that shortage of staff. We're not recognising the increase in elderly patients. We're not recognising people living longer, and we're not recognising that it probably needs in some areas a few more quid to make it work. I'm thinking social care in particular. So in that area, you think of carers and the like, 165,000 shortage. Just let that settle in for 1 second. 165,000 shortage of people in the care sector. A growing population, a growing elderly population. You haven't got to be a senior clinician to work out that this is a proper crisis. This is the definition of the word crisis. This is exactly where the entire focus of the government should be. And every time we talk about it, I sense our eyes sort of glaze over a bit and we go, well, it's probably not going to affect me and not really in my family. And then it does. And then you find yourself in that place. And I will repeat this story. I told this about halfway through the show yesterday, but it's worth just reminding you of the kind of situation that you can find yourself in. So around about 4 weeks ago, my father-in-law sadly passed away. And in the 5 weeks before he died, he was in hospital for those 5 weeks. Now, it was quite clear he was in a bad way, and it was quite clear he wasn't going to get better. And during that time, it was widely recognised that he should probably be at home. Because being in the hospital was, it was probably very depressing. In fact, it was depressing for him. It was doing nothing for his mood, and he was sort of drifting in and out, as is often the case when you're at a situation where you're really not going to make it long term. But he was aware that he was in an area that he didn't want to be in hospital. He wanted to be home, and the family wanted him home as well. And the hospital said, well, we can't send him home because you need the care package put in place. And we said, well, how long does the care package take? They said it might be months. Well, what is a care? What does that look like? We can look after him. They said, well, you can do some of that stuff, but, he will need some specific care. There's also respite needed, even if you are looking after your loved one, etc. So you don't think you're going to find yourself in this situation. And I was, my other half was dealing with this more so than clearly I was. And the conversation she had with doctors and nurses, there were so many of them. And what seemed to happen is you'd have a conversation with one doctor, and then you wouldn't see that doctor again or that nurse again, and somebody else would come on shift, and you'd have to tell them the whole story again, and then the consultant would come around, you've got to tell them the whole story again. And it was quite clear to everybody in this story that the system was absolutely on its knees. They didn't really know what to do. It wasn't a case of saying, patient number 362 is leaving hospital now. This is their address. They live in number 118 Acacia Avenue. Make sure that every now and again somebody is down there, two nurses, two carers, somebody to change the beds and do all the medicines, etc. It doesn't happen like that because there's not enough people to make it happen. And in the end, he was so desperate to leave hospital, and the whole family were desperate for him to leave hospital. And in those last few days, it was quite clear that he wasn't going to make it beyond a few days. And so the decision was taken to allow him to go home. But it took a lot of pressure from my partner to make this happen. And eventually an ambulance showed up, and they took him in the ambulance and dropped him home. He actually sang when he came out of the ambulance. This is a man that is 80 years old. He has severe Parkinson's and dementia, which goes with that, as many of you will know. As he came out of the ambulance and was carried into his own house, he sang. He was aware that his surroundings had changed. And 2 days later, he passed away in the place where he would have wanted to be. But the rigmarole around all of that, this is one patient, just one example, and arguably there are cases where there aren't family around in the same kind of way. I mean, at least we could have done something and did in that very short period of time. What do you do if you've got nothing? What do you do if that's your dad, your mum, your grandparent? In some cases, it may even be somebody younger in the family. Social care isn't just exclusive to the elderly, of course. But there are huge gaps in this. It's an absolute travesty. We're talking about this a bit more now. Not nearly enough. This should be the front pages every single day. This should be almost Rishi Sunak's only song. Daily we should be talking about how do we solve this problem? Massive shortage, elderly population, growing population. How do we solve the crisis? It is a crisis. We should be looking at this as you would any other national emergency. The way we dealt with COVID, we should be dealing with this right now. In fact, some of this right now is because perhaps of the way we dealt with COVID, but we need an absolute focus on this. And if you've had this in your own family, where the NHS or social care has cost a life, or certainly made that life more uncomfortable than it needed to be, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I'll say this to everybody listening and watching right now. Law of averages, you will be there one day. It'll either be yourself or someone in your family. And as we sit here today, our government is not doing anywhere near enough to address what is a crisis. It's as simple as that. 0344 499 1000. How do we fix the UK health crisis?